Hey everybody, I am back. Um, it is currently nap time in the Coon House, and so what nap time means today is that I am in the playroom, and my son is napping on the couch next to me watching Bugs Bunny. So you might hear Bugs Bunny in the background, or you might hear my son again, but doing the best we can in this particular situation. Also, sorry the lighting is very dim, but nap time. Um, okay, so we are going to talk today about communication law and regulation in the digital age. Let me share my screen with you, and then we'll get going. Okay, I'll try to go through this as quickly and efficiently as I can. I know the last one was a little long. Sorry about that. Okay, freedoms, political speech, and regulation. All right, so a lot of this has to do with the First Amendment. And just in case it's been a while since you pulled out your pocket constitution and took a look, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So for our purposes, a lot of what we're talking about today has to do with the free exercise of speech. Okay, now there are some cases where freedom of expression, freedom of speech are regulated. Most significantly, this often happens when it comes to issues of national security. So you may have learned in history class about the Alien Sedition Act of 1798. It's sort of an early example. Today, there are a couple of different scenarios in which we would see alterations to our freedom of expression. One is when there is clear and present danger. So clear and present danger has to qualify, has to meet two criteria. The first, it is speech that is intended to incite or produce dangerous activity, and two, is likely to succeed. So both of those have to be met for our freedom of expression to be altered in terms of clear and present danger. Secondly, prior restraint. So the government blocking or prevention of publication. This is only allowed in cases of severe or grave threats. And the example of this, well, this was really established in the 1931 Supreme Court case Neer versus Minnesota, where the Minnesota courts had stopped a weekly anti-Semitic periodical. They said it was in violation of the state's nuisance law, and the Supreme Court reversed the decision. And that's when they established that that can only happen in cases of serious or grave threats, and there were none in the anti-Semitic magazine. So that was the case that established prior restraint. Preferred position balancing theory is the theory that a balance must be struck between speech and other rights, although speech is given the preferred position. So your freedom of speech can't necessarily interfere with other rights. It has to all be taken in balance. But in the case of sort of all things being equal, speech will be the one that is deferred to. Okay, libel and slander. So people use these terms interchangeably, or they just don't know the difference between them, but that's not going to be the case for you anymore. So libel is a type of defamation that's written and damages a person's reputation or otherwise causes harm. Slander is just the spoken version of libel. That's the simplest way. So in 1964, there's a lot of court cases today. The New York Times versus Sullivan, the Supreme Court ruled that public figures and public officials may not sue for libel unless they can prove actual malice. Right? So if you're a public figure or like a policeman, the president of the United States, a mayor, then you cannot sue journalists for libel unless you show that they were maliciously going after you. What they've printed can be true, untrue, but libel, you have to have actual malice. This is interesting because in different countries, there are different rules for what constitutes libel and what does not, whether or not the information has to be false to be libel. or whether it can be libel even if it's true. So it's sort of an interesting, slander's the same, sort of just an interesting way of looking at it. So in this case, if you are a non-public figure, the standard requires the plaintiff show a reasonable person knew or should have known the defamatory statement was false. So if someone publishes something about me that's not true, um, and they should have known that that was not true, then I can sue for libel. Malice is defined as the defendant's intent being malicious or the defendant's knowing the statement is false but publishing it anyway. So there you go. So to protect journalists against libel, here are some things that you would need to do should you pursue a career in journalism. Thorough research. I mean, that seems obvious, but a lot of people don't do it. And of equal importance is reliable sources. It can't just be some lady you met on the street, right? How do we know they're a reliable source? It's your responsibility to check that out. Secondly, you always have to confirm the identity of the target. Make sure you're talking about the right person. Use quotations when possible and attribute statements. If you use direct quotes, then that puts the onus on the person who gave you the quote as well, and it adds more validity to what you're saying. You have to be careful to report only facts and avoid language that draws conclusions. So this is really important in terms of how you write or produce content in the media. You don't want to draw all the conclusions. You just want to state the facts and let the facts speak for themselves. I'm thinking about this right now. There's a new ad out. We'll talk about it when we get to political ads. It's an ad that Joe Biden's campaign is running on against President Donald Trump. And the president got very upset about this, this ad and started threatening to forbid networks from airing it, which can't do. But the ad is basically just a compilation of video clips of Trump's statements on the coronavirus, including the one where he said it was a Democratic hoax, how one day, poof, it's going to disappear. So it's a collection of those sound bites. That's pretty strong because then you're just letting the person speak for themselves. It doesn't draw any conclusions for you. It does have a wrap-up statement at the end about how we need leadership, but it lets it speak for itself. And then also to avoid bias and strive for balance. That's important too. There are such things as shield laws, which are laws intended to protect journalists from legal challenges and to ensure their freedom in reporting the news. Currently, only 34 states have shield laws. There have been some efforts to create national shield laws, but that hasn't gained enough traction. Okay, censorship. So I'm super fascinated by censorship. We talked a little bit in class about books being taken off the shelves and books being challenged, and films as well have gone through a lot of, gosh, there's been a lot of changes for films when it comes to censorship. So censorship in general is the act of prohibiting certain expression or content. It's usually just a portion of the publication, whatever it is. It's a scene from the movie, or it's a paragraph from a newspaper, or a sound clip from a broadcast news segment. So that's censorship. So it's usually just a portion. In the United States, we see censorship, but it's mostly during wartime situations when there's a fear that the information could put our troops or our nation in harm's way. But also in the case of pornography or obscene content, you'll see censorship at play in the United States. There are certainly countries like China where the government controls so much of the media, North Korea, of course, where censorship is an everyday part of life, and everything goes through the censor and goes through the filter. We have relative freedom with that in the United States, but we still do allow for instances where we need to censor. In terms of American film, because that's my area of interest and focus, the Hays Code was created in 1930, and the Hays Code it was a standard by which films had to be submitted and then screened and approved by the Hays Code before they could be released. And so first, you would submit your script to the Hays Code, and they would, or to the committee, and they would mark it up and tell you what you could and could not do. You send it back. and you would submit the scripts until they were approved. Then you would film the movie and then send it back, and they would send back and tell you the things that need to be cut or changed. And it was quite a long process. It's a lot of hoops to jump through. And the Hays Code was based on these 3 moral principles for film. One, the film cannot lower the moral standards of the audience. So it can't make an argument that an immoral life is a better one. You cannot have immoral characters with whom the audience feels so much sympathy that they begin to to put their stock in that way of living. You can't have that in films. Secondly, it has to show correct standards of life, and those are generalized community standards of the time. And 3, no ridicule of natural or human law. And there's a lot of room for interpretation with that one. But what's interesting to me about a code like this is it's, number one, it's based on a certain set of standards or ethics, and we talked about this in the last video, that are community standards or community ethics. And those, of course, change over time. And frankly, they change by region of the country, age group, all those things. But also, it doesn't put a lot of stock in the fact that the viewer can determine for themselves and discern, the morality of something. So it was an interesting way of going about it. I have on YouTube a video that I want you to watch. And you don't have to watch the whole thing. I know it's a little lengthy. I'm going to show you a little clip, although I don't think you'll be able to hear it. But so there's a wonderful film called A Streetcar Named Desire. It's one of my favorites. It stars Marlon Brando and Vivian Lee, and it's just fantastic. It's an adaptation of my favorite play by my favorite playwright, Tennessee Williams, and has been one of my favorite texts to teach. But in it, in this, let's see. So the film, it's titled A Streetcar Named Desire. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of sexual tension and content in the play and in the film. And it had a terrible time getting through the Hays Code. Also, interestingly, I can't remember the name of the organization, the Catholic League, I think, that during this the mid 20th century, there was also a Catholic organization that would watch movies and rate them. And if they rated the movie C, I think it was, then that meant that no Catholics should go see the movie on, pains of moral corruption or sin. So this movie got that rating. It also had to make some major changes because of the Hays Office. So the part I would love for you to watch this whole thing because it goes through the whole process. But if you skip in, if you're running short of time, if you skip into about 9 minutes in, it's going to show you side by side the way that the film had to be released because of the Hays Code, and then how it was originally filmed, because the original film clippings, because back in these days you actually use scissors and edited film, were found, and so the film's been restored to what Elia Kazan, the director, intended. So, but watch them because I think you'll find it really fascinating, the things that could not get through the code. So this is the 1950s, and so things are very different now. So just watch that, and you'll get a sense of, well, I think you'll be entertained. So the Hays Code stayed around until 1968, and that's when we got a rating system. It's not the rating system we have today, but it's very similar. And then that changed things. When we talked about music, we talked about the explicit lyric sticker and how that changed things, and did it allow for more explicitity in music because you could just put a sticker on it, and the same argument's been made with the rating system. So what is indecent content? That seems relative, but here it is. So in terms of decent content in broadcasting, broadcasters, the standard rule was that they cannot air indecent speech during a safe harbor period, which is when children may be watching, which is approximately 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. But there are permitted words. So for example, damn is a permitted word that can be seen on television. There are the number of permitted words has grown over the years as well. But in the olden days, you wouldn't hear anybody cursing until at least 10 o'clock at night. And then obscenity, what does it mean to be obscene? Number one, an appeal to prurient interests as determined by the community standard, once again, or to offensively show or describe, I should say sexual, apologize, sexual conduct. And content must lack serious artistic, literary, political, or scientific value. So it's considered obscene if it's not being used in a literary way or artistic way. Obviously, when it comes to science and films discussing the human body, documentaries, right, that's fine. So obscenity has to fit one of these. And then criticism, ridicule, and humor are also allowed. And that includes stereotypes. And that's an interesting one because stereotypes can be so damaging because they can affect people's perception of others. And of course, I'm talking about this just as that mouse from Bugs Bunny appears in my son's commercial. I can't remember the mouse's name. You know the one I'm talking about, Speedy Gonzalez, talking about stereotypes. But anyway, so stereotypes are allowed currently, and that's something you should give some thought to and consider. Okay, regulating electronic media, we're almost done. The Radio Act of 1912 started an era in which radio was regulated by the Commerce Department. It had some other elements to it that had to do with radios on ships, traveling across the seas, because radio was used first in that kind of way and then came into popularity, and they needed someone to regulate the frequencies and the call letters. The Radio Act of 1927 created the Federal Radio Commission and promoted the principle that companies have a civic duty to use airways, a limited public good, responsibly. So that maintained that everything that was on the air was responsible to society. In 1934, the Communications Act established the Federal Communications Commission, which we know today, the FCC, and they started granting licenses to those who were considered public trustees, so organizations that could be entrusted to carry on the responsible use of the airwaves for the public good. And then the Telecommunications Act of 1996 retained emphasis on the public good, but that is when there was also a new mandate to foster competition. So up until 1996, really the regulations were all about content and the public good. And then in 1996, competition, economic competition was thrown into the mix as well. And that's certainly changed some things with radio. So the FCC allows stations to operate as commercial or non-commercial educational broadcasters. That would be something like NPR. And they can, they're allowed to do that for 8 years before they renew. They also regulate and prohibit obscene or indecent language, nudity, knowledgeable broadcast of a hoax, including false information regarding a crime or catastrophe, especially when it might cause public harm. And this really came about because of War of the Worlds. In 1938, I believe it was, Orson Welles, who created Citizen Kane, and we talked about this briefly in class, was part of a radio group. So before television and widespread television, you would have radio dramas. It's like the soap operas of today, but you would just hear them on your radio and the whole family would gather around. They had kids shows too. And his radio group did a dramatic, not really a reading of the H.G. Wells book, War of the Worlds, but a dramatic interpretation of it as if it were really happening. And people believed that it was real. And if you're not familiar with that book, it's basically like an alien invasion and people start dying everywhere. And the tragedy of this was that people believed it was real and people committed suicide, people went hysterical, there was violence, it was a disaster. And so after that, there had to be some regulations about the radio. For example, you will rarely hear an ambulance siren or a fire truck siren on the radio. We just don't do that because that can cause panic in the listener. Regulating commercial and political speech, aha. So the FTC enforces antitrust and consumer protection laws, including the 1998 Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, and that limits the ways in which online companies can gather information about your children. An interesting fact is that commercial speech is afforded less First Amendment protection than other forms, and that's due to so much regulation within it. You know, the thing here is, what about unclear regulatory boundaries, like offensive advertising? subliminal programming. What do we do about that? How do we protect it? So I have a couple examples of that. I'll put up on the YouTube page. I'm going to show them to you now because they're basically visuals. And one is, if I can get this screen share to do what I need it to do. So one was a Nivea commercial from several years ago, and they had put out a new product, and the slogan was "White is Purity." And the product was a deodorant that was white. It went on clear so that it didn't get on your dark clothing and show. But of course, Nivea choosing the slogan "White is Purity" is offensive to many. And so they had to pull the ad. It became a huge debacle. Another example occurred with Dove, and Dove had an ad where they had people removing shirts. It's about getting clean. But here we go. You have an African-American woman pulling off a brown shirt to become a white woman in a white shirt. And here, show it one more time. Here she goes. And this person's tweet, I think, is exactly right. I don't know how this got through all the people that have to okay something before it's released, but that caused a huge problem for Dove as well. So, but what do we do about elements like that? It's how do we regulate them? What's the best way to handle it? So that's just something else you should think about. And then political speech. So in the 1934 Communications Act, it also called for the equal time rule, which required broadcasters to make available equal airtime to opposing candidates running for election. Now, this didn't count if the candidate was just being interviewed or if they were doing a news story and there was a rally in the background. But that was to try to prevent stations from contributing to political bias by choosing a candidate. In 1949, it was revised and then called the Fairness Doctrine, which required broadcasters to seek out and present all sides of a controversial issue. That only lasted until 1987 because, of situations like we talked about the other day where we're talking about smoking and you want to make sure that we present the side of cigarettes that's tricky. Like if we're just say no to drugs, kids, but we're going to choose the other side. So it doesn't really work out. Children's programming protection. So the Children's Television Act of 1990 limits the amount of commercial content in children's programming and mandates that each television station provide programming of educational and informational value for children aged 16 and younger. So key here is the amount of commercial content. So if you watch a children's show, you'll find that there are fewer commercials and the duration of the breaks is shorter than when you watch commercials aimed toward adults. And that's because of this act from 1990, that children didn't need to be exposed to that amount of commercialism. There was also something around this time called the V-chip, which could regulate certain levels of violence in shows and not allow, basically to censor them for your children. And that led to parent controls, which some of you when you were growing up may have had parent controls on some of your devices. I mean, I definitely have them on mine. Once my son bought an episode of Cupcake Wars with Scooby-Doo cupcakes. So I have it on there so he doesn't buy everything, but also because I don't need him to suddenly stumble upon Magic Mike, for example. I will tell you this because I think it's a funny story now. So when I was growing up, we didn't have these kinds of parent controls, and my family I had a very young aunt who lived with us, and she loved like all those 80s teenager movies. And so my family would use a VCR and they would make appropriate versions of movies for me. So like Dirty Dancing, Colt's favorite. I watched that movie. Oh my gosh, I feel like one summer when I was in elementary school, I must have watched it every day. Like I just thought it was the best. And then I saw it later and I'm like, whoa, like where did the rest of this come from? Like the girl has a botched abortion, they have sex, There's all kinds of things in there that were not in my version, and they did the same thing with the film Flashdance. And so my family made their own videos for me. So the VCHIP and parent controls have made it significantly easier for parents. Okay, and then finally, intellectual property rights. So copyright, patent, and trademark, you just should know the differences among these three. Copyright protects the right to use, publish, reproduce, perform, display, or distribute a literary and artistic work. Patents protect the rights to produce and sell an invention, and the trademark protects the right to use a particular sign, logo, or name. And interestingly, years ago, Donald Trump, before he was president, when he was on The Apprentice, he tried to trademark the phrase, "You're fired." And his trademark request was denied because there was a company who had trademarked the phrase, "You're hired," and they said that his was too close to that. So, so that's the difference between those three things. Fair use is the allowable use of someone else's copyrighted work that does not require payment of royalties, but your request has to have a number of factors, including you have to tell the purpose and nature of the use, the character of the copyrighted work, the amount and extent of the excerpt that you're going to use, and the effect on the work's market potential. So you can't do anything that would negatively affect the market potential of a work, but you can apply for fair use. So there are some things for intellectual property rights, but now with the internet, that's gotten so much more complicated. Particularly with ideas. So there's a lot more to say about that, and there's more to come as well. That'd be a great topic for a research paper, just saying. All right, so I'm going to post this, and then I'll put those YouTube videos on our playlist as well. Let me stop sharing. So I'm going to put an activity and a forum post up for you. And I hope you're engaging with those. I would really love it if you could go back through the forum and see if someone's made a comment that you'd like to engage with, either agreeing with them or disagreeing or asking a question, because I do miss our class discussions, and that's an important part of what we're doing. So otherwise, I think that's it for today. I hope you guys are doing well, and yeah, I missed you. I miss being in class with you. I hope you're surviving living back home with your family all of a sudden in the middle of the semester, especially you seniors who have probably not lived at home fully in quite some time. I know that can be a struggle, so I've been thinking about y'all that way. I hope you're able to adjust and find time for yourselves. All right, so I'm going to let you go, and I will talk to you soon. Bye, guys.